Happy Monday, everyone, and welcome to the last video lecture of our class. Each semester that I've taught this class, I like to think hard about what our final reading should be, and I picked a different one every semester. What I really look for is a chapter or an article that zooms out and gives us a bird-eyes perspective, a 30,000-foot view of just what we've learned over the course of the semester. It needs to be something, of course, that addresses the value of history. This is a history class, but we've also spent a lot of time thinking about governance, decision-making in the ancient world, analyzing where the Athenians and the Spartans acted efficiently and maybe where they went wrong. And of course, perhaps most importantly, I want an article that can speak to our future, the future of young people like you, and what lessons it can help teach us about how to become our best selves moving forward. I selected this reading on the future of democracy way back in December before the class started. I had no way of knowing that we would be struck, of course, with a pandemic, coronavirus, that would be one of the major events that these two scholars in this reading flag as a potential threat to democracy. But now more than ever, I think their insights about the ancient world and about our goals moving forward as a country committed to democracy are really valuable. And while their title might seem a little doomsday, is democracy destined to fail, I ultimately think they offer us an optimistic and encouraging roadmap about how to improve on the democracies of our predecessors. In today's lecture, I'd like to kind of summarize their key findings, put them into perspective for you as you walk away from this class, complete your final projects, and take those lessons into your own personal life, whatever career path you might be pursuing. So let's get started. All semester long, we have been evaluating the Greek world with special attention paid to Athens and Sparta, and at the very end to Thebes, as each of these city-states tries to figure out how to be a leader of the Greeks while also perfect their own decision-making processes. And while Sparta, Athens, and Thebes are very different places, what we do see across the board is that in the Greek world, their forms of government are committed in some way to the notions of equality and representation. Now that, of course, is not for all people. Women, foreigners are not included, nor are they identical, right? Sparta and Athens organize very differently. But what really they have in common is that Greeks will define themselves in opposition to Persians, to other Eastern kings, and even to the Macedonians, in that they are a people who do not want to be ruled by a single king or tyrant. The most radical system of all of these, of course, is Athenian direct democracy, the belief that anyone, even the lowliest among us, can and should participate directly in the governance of their city. Now, for today's reading, I asked you to read over an article written by two scholars of history, classics, political science, Brooke Manville and Josiah Ober. The title of their article, In Search of Democracy 4.0, is Democracy as We Know It Destined to Die, is on the one hand a backwards-looking piece. It sort of spans very quickly the history of democratic governance, but it's also forward-looking. This piece was written relatively quickly after the 2016 election of Donald Trump, and they recognize that that election made Americans on both sides of the political spectrum feel that we are at a teetering moment in our own democracy, that we have less understanding than ever before of each other's views, and that there's a widening gap in the role that people think government should play, or whether it's a benefit to us or potentially a damaging factor or institution in our lives. And so these two figures are offering what I find a refreshingly different way to approach the question of democracy, and optimistic in its notion that democracy is something constantly evolving and constantly changing with each civilization that tries it out. Let me explain what I mean by that just a little bit. If you take a look at traditional analyses of the history of democracy, or even just if you find people casually representing the history of the world, mostly in Western civilization, what you see is that people tend to describe democracy as sort of something that sort of rises and falls, or as I'm calling in this slide, rises and crashes. Right? We have this notion that world history, primitive world history, begins with warlords and chieftains, like this picture of Agamemnon I have here on the left. He, of course, was the mythical leader of the Greeks in the Trojan War. But then over time, gradually, the Greeks build up something more equality-based, right? Athenian democracy. But then, of course, after the Athenians are defeated by Macedon, and we head further into the ancient world and then into the medieval world, we get the rise of kings and emperors again. Slowly again, gradually in the Renaissance, we'll see democracy. And then now, as Manville and Ober note on my very last picture of Kim Jong-un, they say that many people right now today are worried that democracy is again on its downward crash mode, that we're seeing strongmen like Putin, like Xi Jinping rising and threatening the democratic world order that we were so certain of in the 20th century. Indeed, if you take a look at sort of democracy charts in the 20th century, you'll see that many political scientists and historians thought that the 20th century was the boom time for democracy, after which there would be no turning back. In the aftermath of World War I, as the great empires of the world, like the British Empire, disbanded, and as communism fell in the Soviet Union and was challenged in East Asia, many historians thought that democracy was just headed up, 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 and up, and that, again, that there would really be no challenge. Of course, people are not as convinced of that today, as we see the rise of neo-fascist movements, and as people are placing less faith in the democratic order than our grandparents and our great-grandparents did. Now, Ober and Manville, I think, are quite creative in that they are not interested in replicating this sort of rise, crash traditional view of the history of democracy. Instead, both of these historians ask us to take a more technological perspective on democracy. Curiously, they ask us to think of it almost like software or computer coding. What if we stopped thinking of democracy as a system that rises and crashes? What if we thought of democracy as a computer software that had updates and got fewer and fewer bugs? In their text, you can see I've snipped something from the textbook. What if we can think of democracy as a sort of software for human governance, and its engineers improve its future releases? By this notion, what we might be seeing is that not that democracy comes and goes away and comes and goes away, but rather that democracy has glitches, has bugs, and that as the centuries pass and as more and more people are exposed to and try to use the democratic system, it gradually gets better. And so maybe what we're seeing in ancient Athens and their democracy is an early version, a primitive version of what we have now. And maybe in 1,000 years from now, the democracy that we have will seem primitive and glitchy to our successors. Who knows? Now, I'm no computer science major or video game designer, but I think that anyone who works with coding and computers will tell you it's important before you design a code to know what is the code meant to do, right? What is the program or the software you're designing created to execute? And in the analogy of Manville and Ober, they essentially say that if democracy is some sort of political software, its goal and its core never fundamentally changes. How can people govern themselves operating freely and in some ways equals without answering to a quote-unquote boss? What Manville and Ober are getting at here is that yes, systems of government change, yes, technology changes, but what hasn't changed about democracy is its core function, to allow people in a given society to move freely, to make their own life decisions in such a way that there is still a sense of harmony, unity, shared values, shared objectives, and laws, standards. Across history, whether it's the Greek male citizen here, he wants to make his own decisions. Or perhaps the French revolutionary who wanted to make his own decisions. Or today, a young businesswoman who wants to make her own decisions. That value of democracy fundamentally hasn't changed. Now, after explaining the core function of this software, Manville and Ober take a deep dive back into ancient history to bring us some insights from the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle, of course, we've read a few times this semester. We also know he taught Alexander the Great and had been exposed to democratic system of governments, oligarchy, and monarchy. A bright person with a lot of deep experience to draw from. Now, according to Aristotle, if you want to build a democracy that works, and again, keep in mind in his time, democracy meant male citizens only, Greeks, not foreigners, no children, usually military participation of some kind. But all that aside, in principle, if you want to build a democracy that works, there are three fundamental elements or ingredients that you have to build upon. And I'd like to take a couple minutes and just go over those three ingredients. The first one, perhaps the most important, is you have to have a sense of a civic community. What territory, what community is this democracy working for? We have to have a defined body of persons inhabiting a territory, sharing certain values, and pursuing certain common goals. Aristotle is not saying here that we all have to be replicas of each other. We don't have to see the world exactly the same way. But if we're going to have a functioning democracy, we kind of have to know who is this democracy for and have at least a baseline understanding of what a good life or a good governance looks like. Ingredient number 2, we have to have a clear definition of citizenship. You'll remember in our game sessions, defining citizens was actually a whole game day. Were slaves, considered citizens? How about women? How about children of only half Athenian bloodlines? Fighting about the definition of citizenship is one of the most persistent aspects of an evolving democracy. But democracy doesn't work if we don't know who gets included, what's required of them, what privileges they have as citizens in that democracy. They must be roughly equal in their access to public forums and their chance to influence public decisions. Citizens enjoy certain privileges but take on substantial responsibilities. I pay taxes as an American citizen to America in order to support American causes. Democracy doesn't work if you have twice as many votes as I do. We have to be about equal in the amount of say that we have. Although there's plenty of people in America today who would say that we are in no way, shape, or form equal. But we'll leave that aside for a minute. The last ingredient, according to Aristotle, and this one can be a little tricky to find, is that there has to be a baseline respect for the norms and the rules of our democracy. They're both the formal rules and the informal behavioral norms that make citizenship into an active practice. We must be willing to bear the costs of governing ourselves. I think one of the places that you can most see this in American society is with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not control a military. It doesn't really have the means to enforce its ruling per se. But when the Supreme Court makes a decision, whether it's about church and state or interracial marriage or abortion, we respect it, even if we fundamentally disagree with it. And that's because we've all agreed as American citizens that the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land and that its decisions are to be respected. There's plenty of other places where you can see rules and norms. For example, voting anonymously, right? I mean, when you go and you enter the booth, right? People can't see what your vote is. You would never be able to get away with it as a poll worker if you demanded a sort of public hand vote counting. There are behavioral rules and norms that we all have to respect in order for this to work. Now, in addition to the three main things that Aristotle highlights as requirements for any functioning democracy, Ober and Manville also turned to Aristotle to look at his perspective on the three main threats. And I'm going to go over these, but not quite in as much time because we're going to look at some examples in ancient Athens. According to Ober and Manville, Aristotle's three main threats, the things that can really take down a democracy, are both external and internal. The external threats are things that citizens themselves don't necessarily have a whole lot of control over. War, famine, plague, invasions. These days we might put cybersecurity threats or biowarfare on here. Now, this can be tricky for a democracy because democracies, as we've learned, are not the fastest decision-making method. It's way faster to just have a king say, do this, I command this. But democracies often require deliberation, they require debate. And so, for a democracy to survive a major external threat, they have to find a way to come together quickly, work together, and make the best decisions they can in the moment without a lot of back and forth bickering. That's why something like a war or a coronavirus can, if we can't agree on the best path forward, really put a dent in our democratic system. And in addition to those external threats are also internal threats. When people here within our own democracy begin to threaten or hamper the rules and values we've established. Think about someone like Pisistratus or the 30 tyrants, right, who disregard the Athenian democratic system. Or also dangerous, monopolies of power, when the checks and balances no longer work, when people rapidly rewrite the laws or just ignore them, or whenever we see excessive money and manipulation of information playing a key role, right? I mean, democracy presumes that I and you and I have the same voting power. But if you have way more money than me and you can spend that on ads and I can't, all of a sudden your ability to speak gets a lot louder. Or information. If I can't get good, factual, nonpartisan information on which to make my political decisions, if my information is being limited or it's being biased, then that really challenges the playing field of democracy we all agree on. The last bullet point that Aristotle talks about is rapid expansion of citizenship. When we add mass numbers of new citizens or criteria for citizenship to new peoples and new territories, it can have the effect of watering down our democracy. Democracy works only if you and I agree on who the players are, who our cultural values and systems are representing. If we decide, or if one political party decides, for example, to add millions of new citizens who may or may not share our common culture and value system, well, that really can do a number on democratic equality and democratic governance. Now, where can we see these three threats at play in Athens? I think we can see number one and number two pretty clearly just from the history we've learned in this class. The external threats of Athens are not hard to identify. The Peloponnesian War. We saw in many ways that Athens' ability to resist Sparta came down largely into the hands of who was the general of the moment. When it was Pericles, he broadly made good decisions for Athens against the Spartans, but it was his policy to pull people inside the walls. And Alcibiades, we know, in smack dab in the middle of the Peloponnesian War, led the Athenians on a rather foolhardy mission to Sicily. We also saw the plague did a real number on the Athenians. It killed Pericles and gave rise to warmongering demagogues like Cleon. And Philip Macedon really was the sort of existential final threat to Athens that knocked out the knees from its democracy really up until the 19th century. So those are kind of our external threat categories. Internal threats in Athens, specifically number two, not respecting the norms and values. Tyrants, we've seen time and again. The very first tyrant, Pisistratus, who overthrew the democracy established by Solon. The rise of the 400 oligarchs in 411, and the rise of the 30 tyrants right before our game, and how hard we as Athenians had to fight to reassert our democracy, sometimes swinging dangerously on the opposite pendulum and killing off someone like Socrates because we're paranoid. And although Pericles himself was sort of known as a father of Athenian democracy, I also think there's many ways that you could consider his democratic reforms to be, a sort of so powerful a restructuring of Athenian government, you could consider him riding roughshod over Athenian democracy. For example, when Pericles decides to pass a law to dramatically limit citizenship in a way that hadn't been seen since the time of archaic Athens, or when Pericles and his colleague Ephialtes minimized the powers of the Areopagus Council. These are two people who radically restructured Athenian, paying people to come to the assembly, right? You could definitely consider those moves to be such a dramatical intervention in the norms of Athenian politics to constitute an internal threat. Now, we never quite saw in either our game or in Athenian history a rapid expansion of citizenship. It never really took place in historical Athens, even if both of my sections, you guys allowed for Lysias to come and join us. But I think that we could imagine someone like a Thrasybulus in both classes. If he had been successful in getting citizenship for all slaves and all metics, we might have seen a doubling of the male Athenian citizenship in such a way that might have watered down the core values and culture of Athens itself. Now, if we take a very traditional look at the rise and fall of Athenian democracy, we will all be pretty tempted to say, as in fact I did, that Greek freedom ends at the Battle of Chaeronea. When Philip destroys the Greek world, he ends democracy. And in a sense, that is true. Athens won't ever be a full-fledged direct democracy again in its history, at least not in the way it was utterly self-governing as it was in the 5th century. But Manville and Ober want us to think about this rise and fall narrative differently. Again, go back to their software or their coding metaphor. For these two scholars, the end of Athens is not a collapse, but rather a blueprint for future democracies. Athens may not be a functioning democracy, but the coding, the software is not gone, and other civilizations will use it. As they mention in their passage on the Romans borrowed and adapted key Greek technologies. Like Athens, Rome was a community with a strong civic self-consciousness. It had a citizen body. It did reduce citizens' participatory role in government. And they also found a way to make it scalable. The Romans really take what they see in Athenian democracy that they like, and they also try to find ways to limit the things that they think make it inefficient. They don't do, for example, lottery system citizenship selections, and they find a way to make it bigger and bigger as Rome expands, so that they don't end up with the same problem the Athenians had with the Delian League, where all of this expanse of the Mediterranean was controlled by one city-state that was not interested in sharing citizenship benefits with others. And perhaps ironically, almost 1,000, 2,000 years later, Renaissance Italy will also be interested in using that Greek blueprint of democracy, and this time they're drawing on both the Greek model and the Roman model. To read from the text, from the article, Florence and Venice were leaders in experimenting with forms of local citizenship government, and also tried to kind of build on that scalability. So Athenian democracy, in Manville and Ober's perspective, it doesn't die, it just becomes reused by later civilizations. And perhaps no one was a better scholar of the Greeks and then the Romans than our own founding fathers, if you're an American citizen. Our founding fathers were brilliant readers of the classics. They had definitely read their Thucydides, their Herodotus, their Plato, and their Aristotle. And when figures like Hamilton and Jefferson read over the works of the great classics, they were deeply influenced and committed to creating a system of governance that took the best from the ancient world while improving on it. Again, just like that upgrade, that software improvement. Our founding fathers are strongly influenced. Although they embraced the same core ends and values as the ancients, they were really wary of mob democracy. They don't want a sort of popular support or populist support of someone like an Alcibiades or a Cleon. They hoped to create a system that was scalable like the Roman Republic, but insulated from Roman authoritarianism. Kind of like the Thebans, they will be attracted to this idea of federalism, of balancing powers, of giving people in smaller localities control over their own civic space, while also answering to a larger unified power at the top. So clearly here, Athenian democracy and other Greek models of government are not dead in America. They're right at the core of our foundation, the substructure of our political code. Many Americans of both political parties, however, feel that we've come a long way, and not necessarily for the better, from the ideals of our founding fathers. Yes, we've made improvements. We've allowed people of African American heritage to have citizenship. We've also allowed women to vote and have citizenship. But today there's a number of disturbing trends that make both scholars and common people worry if some of Aristotle's trouble spots are on the horizon for us as well. Are we perhaps facing big external threats? Invasion, maybe cyber invasion by foreign powers? Are we facing an American plague that's going to radically reshape the way our democracy works? When I watch those protests in Wisconsin and Michigan and in North Carolina right now on the news, I see people out there protesting against the shutdown and stay-at-home orders. Part of that, of course, is sometimes belonging to a different political party than the governor. But I also think people are worried that our government may abuse their power, that they might take an opportunity of this pandemic to establish a sort of authoritarian rule that isn't acceptable under other normal circumstances. People of both parties are also concerned about the way our government is being changed, overridden, or ignored in the fighting between political parties. Take, for example, the debate over appointing Supreme Court justices. Obama appointed a Supreme Court justice in the last 9 months of his presidency, and the Senate decided, the Republican-controlled Senate, decided just not to take that up. Of course, is that a violation of the rules or a rewriting of the Constitution? It depends how you see it. But there are clearly gamesmanships being created in order to find creative interpretations or favorable interpretations of our law codes. And of course, there is huge disagreement these days about citizens. Who should be citizens? How do we define citizenship? Many Americans are concerned about what it would mean for our culture, for our values, for our education, to have a populace that looks radically different culturally, ethnically, religiously from the one we had 50 years ago, 100 years ago. America is, of course, a melting pot nation, but that doesn't mean that we don't have some cultural values that people don't want to necessarily see eroded. All of these topics come up in the Manville and Ober article, and they seem pessimistic. Maybe American democracy really is on the brink of collapse. But I actually think that what Manville and Ober are doing is encouraging us to see in our concerns and our anxieties about our institutions today a path forward, new ideas about how to create a democracy 4.0. They begin by emphasizing that whatever changes we make, whatever new creative approach to democracy we come up with, we still need to keep those 3 core values defined by Aristotle. We have to make sure we have a clear sense of what our civic community is and what we want to achieve. We must define citizenship clearly, fairly, and uphold that. And perhaps most importantly, we have to have a respect for the rules and norms of our system. We can't continue to cycle and circle each other, each side accusing the other of undermining the system or being corrupt. No democracy can thrive if nobody trusts the system. And so, towards the close of their article, they really outline a number of exciting new opportunities for the leaders of tomorrow in rebuilding that democracy 4.0. Maybe we should examine what our core value systems are or whether we even still have them. Maybe the different regions of the US have become so different in culture and values that we want to rethink whether this federal model is really working. How might we use technology or outreach to get people to participate directly again? In America today, we often see that less than half the population votes, even lower in local elections and state elections. What might it take to get people fired up and to feel like their voice and that their vote actually counts? And perhaps most challenging when we think big, the world is way more global than it was in ancient times. People move all over the continents in ways that was pretty much inconceivable in ancient history. How do we define citizenship in a world of global connectivity when you can literally get on the phone, have a connection and a conversation with someone who lives a world away from you? Maybe our values now are not defined by the place of our birth, but by the kind of world we want to build. All of those are open and available to us. As we conclude, and these are difficult times in our country right now, not just politically, but of course as we face down a pandemic and the uncertainty surrounding it. If there is one ray of real light in their article, it's that Manville and Ober emphasize that crisis is often the catalyst for innovation. One I think was one of their most cheerful paragraphs, they say, history shows democracies collapsing in a crisis of a scale challenge. Crisis can be a stimulus for reinvention. Ancient Athenians devised democratic solutions to internal factionalism and repression by tyrants, and the English and American revolutions are born out of monarchy that seems really repressive. As we have a moment of pause and a moment of quiet to rethink how connected we are in a moment of social isolation, this is, in my mind, and I hope in yours, an opportunity to think, how could democracy be better, serve more people, and give people a confidence and trust in both each other and their institution of governments? When this COVID-19 crisis is over, when we get to be outside and with each other again, I hope you take that energy, enthusiasm, and lessons from the past in order to remake the world in the best way as you see it. All right, guys, looking forward to some exam prep with you all. And yeah, big, heavy, happy thoughts, I hope. Huge hug. Take care.